Calm down now, Elijah Cross.
Diana?
A professional would see that stain before being reminded.
I'll wipe it again.
At least this job doesn't require...
Wait, who just wrote that?
I could be wrong, but if the error is in the weight... A janitor just walked into a top-secret technical meeting. That's a serious violation.
He just saved the company from over $200 million. I didn't come to invite you back to work, Elijah. I came because the company needed brains they ignored.
What about Russell Pratt?
Thanks for watching. Follow A Brighter Destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Surprised. The application sat at the bottom of the stack and Diana Marsh almost missed it entirely. Surprised. She had been moving through custodial resumes since 8:14 that morning, one gray page after another, each one blending into the last the way tired paperwork always does. Surprised. But the name on that final sheet made her stop with her coffee halfway to her mouth, the steam curling up past her fingers. Surprised. Elijah Cross. She read it once, then again, as if the second reading might rearrange the letters into someone else's name. Surprised. Across the lobby, a man sat in one of the stiff plastic chairs with his hands folded over his knees, wearing a canvas jacket that had clearly survived more winters than it should have. Surprised. Diana did not send for him through the front desk the way she had for the other 9 candidates that morning. Surprised. She walked out herself, folder in hand, and stood in front of him until he looked up. Surprised. There was no flicker of recognition on his face at first, only the polite confusion of a man trying to place someone who already knew him. Surprised. Then it arrived slowly, the way a light comes on in an old house, room by room. Surprised. Diana, he said, not a question. Just her name, spoken the way you say the name of something you thought the years had taken from you for good. Surprised. She brought him into her office instead of the standard interview room, a decision she made without examining it too closely, and set his folder on the desk between them, like it might explain something neither of them had said out loud yet. Surprised. Elijah Cross had been the kind of graduate student that professors still mentioned a decade later, not because he was loud in seminar, but because difficult proofs seemed to soften in his hands. Surprised. Diana had sat 2 seats down from him in an applied mathematics course at the University of Washington, failing quietly while the rest of the room kept pace without effort. Surprised. Elijah had never once made her feel small about it. Surprised. He explained a differential equation the way a good mechanic explains an engine, not to impress you, but to make sure the thing runs when you turn the key. Surprised. Then her final year he vanished. No forwarding address. Surprised. No conference presentations with his name on the program. Just gone the way people go when life takes a hard left turn without asking permission. Surprised. And now 17 years later at 8:41 on a gray Tuesday morning, he was sitting in her lobby applying to mop floors. Surprised. His application was filled out in careful block letters, the handwriting of a man who had learned somewhere that neatness bought him a fraction more patience from strangers. Surprised. Under previous employment, there were jobs Diana would never have guessed for him. A produce warehouse in Tacoma, an overnight stocking shift at a distribution center off I-5, 4 months delivering auto parts before the route was eliminated. Surprised. Under education, one date, applied mathematics, University of Washington, program discontinued. Surprised. He hadn't listed a GPA, though she remembered it being the kind of number that made department chairs quietly ask around about him. Surprised. HR flagged your file before it reached me, she said, keeping her voice level because the alternative was to sound like exactly what she was, a woman struggling to reconcile 2 completely different pictures of the same person. Surprised. They said your qualifications were, in their words, excessive for the position. Surprised. Elijah nodded like this was old news to him, which, judging by the calm on his face, it was. Surprised. Figured they might, he said. Wasn't sure it'd survive the first screening. Surprised. Why janitorial? He didn't answer right away. Surprised. Diana had forgotten how comfortable he'd always been with silence, letting a question sit in the room until it had earned its answer. Surprised. When he finally spoke, there was no rehearsed softness in it, no performance built to make her feel better about whatever had happened to him. Surprised. I need something stable, he said. No deadlines that move on me. Surprised. No politics. I show up, I do the work. I know exactly what I'm walking home to. Surprised. A beat. I raise my daughter alone. She needs a father who's predictable more than she needs one who's impressive. Surprised. Diana felt that land somewhere below her professional instincts, in a place she hadn't opened at work in years. Surprised. She told him there was an entry-level data analyst position that paid nearly triple the custodial wage, that she could move his file over without a single person needing to know it had ever gone anywhere else. Surprised. Not quite gratitude, not quite refusal. Surprised. I appreciate that, he said. I mean it. But I'd like the janitor job if it's still open. Surprised. No apology in his voice, no defensiveness bracing for an argument. Surprised. I'm not ready to be visible again, not yet. Surprised. Diana had run a company with 3,000 employees for 8 years. Surprised. She had made decisions worth tens of millions of dollars in either direction without losing sleep. Surprised. She was not a woman who surprised easily, and yet something in the quiet certainty of Elijah Cross's voice reached past every instinct she had and landed somewhere entirely human. Surprised. She told him the position was his. She told HR to process the paperwork before lunch. Surprised. Elijah started the following Monday, arriving before the building's doors officially opened at 6 a.m. Surprised. Diana didn't learn this from him. She learned it from Marcus Eby, the overnight security guard, who mentioned it the way you mention something unremarkable, that the new custodian was always already there by the time he clocked out, moving a mop across the lobby floor like he had nowhere better to be, and was perfectly at peace with that, Sir Marcus said. Doesn't say much. Nods at you like the nod means something. Surprised. By the end of his first week, Elijah had reorganized the fourth-floor supply closet in a way that cut restocking time by nearly 40%. Surprised. Nobody had asked him to. The facilities manager noticed and mentioned it to nobody in particular, the way small competence often slides past unnoticed in a building full of people solving bigger problems. Surprised. But not everyone was indifferent to him. The operations floor answered to a man named Russell Pratt, who had been with the company for 11 years and had long ago mistaken seniority for authority. Surprised. Pratt was the kind of manager who spoke loudly in open-plan spaces and kept a running mental ledger of who owed him deference. Surprised. Within Elijah's first 2 weeks, Pratt had called him back 3 separate times to redo floors that didn't need redoing. Surprised. He'd interrupted Elijah mid-task in front of 4 junior staffers to point out a smear on a window that upon inspection wasn't there. Surprised. He asked Elijah once, in front of the same 4 staffers, whether he had someone at home to help him stay organized. The question wrapped in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Surprised. Elijah absorbed all of it without visible reaction. He nodded when appropriate. Surprised. He went back to work the way water moves around a stone, not because the stone wins, but because moving around it costs less than fighting it. Surprised. Here's the part worth remembering before we go further. The people who mistake a quiet man for a small one are almost never prepared for what happens when the room finally needs him. Surprised. Diana witnessed one of the exchanges herself, crossing the operations floor on her way to a server room inspection. Surprised. She stopped at the edge of an aisle and watched Pratt explain, slowly and with exaggerated patience, that a professional would have caught a scuff mark by the elevator before being told. Surprised. 3 employees nearby suddenly found their monitors fascinating. Elijah looked at the mark, said he'd take care of it, and turned back toward his cart without a trace of tension in his shoulders. Surprised. Pratt caught Diana's eye across the room, straightened his collar, and walked back to his office like a man recalculating an equation he didn't like the answer to. Surprised. Diana said nothing that day, but she filed it away in the part of her mind that kept score. Surprised. Weeks folded into a rhythm. Elijah moved through the building like a fixed point. Always present, always exactly where he was supposed to be. Surprised. Renee Walsh, the ground floor receptionist who remembered every face that walked through the door, started leaving a cup of coffee on the utility cart near his supply closet each morning without a word of explanation. Surprised. Elijah drank it and left the empty cup where she'd find it. Surprised. Nothing was ever said about it. It simply happened, the way kindness sometimes moves through a building without needing an announcement. Surprised. Diana caught herself watching him some mornings, not with a CEO's eye for performance, but with the particular attention you give something you're trying to understand. Surprised. He was not performing contentment. She had performed contentment herself in board meetings more times than she wanted to admit, but Elijah's calm was not a performance. Surprised. It was simply what remained of a man after the years had taken what they were going to take. Surprised. She hadn't asked him again about the past. She'd decided to let him bring it to her when he was ready. Surprised. But the question hadn't left her. It lived in the back of her, thinking the way a half-remembered melody lives behind everything else you hear. Surprised. One evening, leaving the office at 8:52 p.m., she found him wringing out a mop near the front entrance, the lobby empty and quiet around him. Surprised. "You're still here," she said. "Few more hallways," he answered. Surprised. She stood a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Surprised. "Are you all right, Elijah?" She wasn't entirely sure what she meant by it, that night or the 17 years or all of it at once. Surprised. "Yeah," he said without qualification, which was either the most honest answer she'd heard in months or the most carefully guarded one. Surprised. She said goodnight and walked to her car. In the reflection of the glass doors behind her, she could see him still moving, unhurried and exact, like a man keeping a private promise nobody else had been told about. Surprised. The crisis arrived on a Thursday the way most technology failures do, quietly and then all at once. Surprised. A flag appeared in the monitoring system at 6:03 a.m. Surprised. Dismissed by the overnight team as routine noise. Surprised. By 9, the anomaly had burrowed into the core routing engine that powered freight logistics for the company's 3 largest clients. Surprised. By 11, the engineering leads were packed into the 7th floor conference room with their laptops open and their faces arranged in the particular stillness that means things are worse than anyone is saying out loud. Surprised. Diana arrived at 11:17. Grant Foley, the technical director, explained that the optimization algorithm governing the distribution network had developed a cascading error in its core function. Surprised. Left uncorrected for another 6 hours, the system would begin generating faulty routing data, an outcome that translated at that scale into roughly $211 million in contractual exposure. Surprised. Foley's team had been working since 7 Sound and had found where the failure was showing up, but not where it began. Surprised. The mathematics behind the break was buried somewhere inside a sequence of calculations that none of the 12 engineers in that room had yet managed to isolate. Surprised. The whiteboard along the far wall was a mess of 3 different marker colors, arrows connecting variables to outcomes that didn't hold, 3 abandoned approaches layered over one another like sediment. Surprised. Elijah arrived at 11:38, though nobody in the room had asked for him. Surprised. He was supposed to be clearing the hallway outside as part of his Thursday rotation. Surprised. The conference room door had been propped open with a chair to allow foot traffic to the adjacent server closet, and Elijah worked his way down the hallway until he stood in the doorway, ready to move the chair and shut the door so he could finish his floor. Surprised. He did not move the chair. He looked at the whiteboard instead, and something in his posture went very still. Surprised. Nobody noticed him for almost 90 seconds. The room was too consumed by its own pressure. Engineers typing, Foley on a phone call, 2 analysts arguing quietly over a printed spreadsheet by the windows. Surprised. Diana, standing near the back wall reviewing something on her tablet, was the one who looked up and found him there. Surprised. He was not reading the board the way a curious bystander reads something unfamiliar. Surprised. He was reading it the way you read a page you already know, checking whether what's written matches what you carry in your head. Surprised. He turned and found Diana's eyes without searching for them. Surprised. There was a question in his face, not spoken, just present, asking whether this was his place to speak. Surprised. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage without drawing the room's attention. Surprised. He crossed to the whiteboard, picked up a black marker from the tray, and found a clear section in the bottom right corner. Surprised. He didn't write slowly, and he didn't write with the performance of a man trying to prove something. Surprised. He wrote the way you write when the answer is already formed and your hand is simply catching up to your mind. 7 lines of calculation, tight and exact, ending in a single bracketed expression that isolated the point of failure inside the routing algorithm. Surprised. Then he capped the marker and stepped back. Tyler Nash, a junior engineer 11 months into the job and not yet practiced at hiding his reactions, looked at the board and said out loud, "Wait, who wrote that?" Surprised. The room turned. Someone laughed, a short, uncertain sound, because the man standing by the whiteboard was wearing a gray uniform with the company crest stitched over the chest pocket, and his mop cart was parked by the door. Surprised. "I could be wrong," Elijah said, in the same even tone he might use to mention a soap dispenser running low on the 3rd floor. Surprised. "But if your error's in the waiting function, that's where I'd start looking." Surprised. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when nobody has a script ready. Surprised. Foley walked to the board, stood in front of Elijah's 7 lines for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and ran the numbers himself. Surprised. His expression moved through several stages: skepticism, focus, recognition, and finally the very specific look of a man watching someone open a locked door without a key. Surprised. "Run it," Foley said to the room, still staring at the board. Surprised. 11 minutes later, the error flag cleared. The cascading failure stopped exactly where it was and did not progress an inch further. Surprised. Nobody said anything to Elijah directly. He retrieved his cart from near the door, finished clearing the hallway, and moved on to the next section of his rotation. Surprised. By the time the room had recomposed itself around the relief of the crisis being over, he was already 2 floors down, wringing out a rag over a bucket like nothing unusual had happened at all. Surprised. Word of it moved through the building the way things always do. Not through official memos, but through the quiet network of people who'd been in the room, and the people those people told. Surprised. By 5 that afternoon, enough of the right people knew that the janitor had solved in under 2 minutes a problem that had stalled 12 engineers for 6 hours. Surprised. Russell Pratt heard about it before 4:45. He came to Diana's office at 5:03 without knocking, arms crossed, and delivered a speech he had clearly rehearsed on the elevator ride up. Surprised. What had happened, he said, was a serious breach of protocol. Surprised. An hourly custodial employee had entered a restricted technical meeting, engaged directly with proprietary system architecture, and done so without authorization from anyone in his management chain. Surprised. He used the word liability twice and the word precedent once, making it clear he believed the matter required a formal response, and that the response should be aimed squarely at the man who'd caused it. Surprised. Diana let him finish. Then she asked him one question, whether the algorithm had in fact been fixed. Surprised. Pratt said that was beside the point. Diana said it was, in fact, exactly the point, and that she would look into the matter herself. Surprised. Her tone made it clear the conversation had ended. Pratt left. Surprised. She knew what he was doing. She'd seen the same institutional reflex before in other companies. The particular defensiveness that activates when someone outside the approved hierarchy does something the hierarchy couldn't. Surprised. It wasn't really about protocol. It was about the fact that a man who mopped floors for a living had solved something a room full of six-figure engineers hadn't. And that kind of disruption threatens certain people more than any system error ever could. Surprised. 3 days later, 2 board members reached out directly, having been briefed carefully, she suspected, by someone with a vested interest in the framing, on the conference room incident. Surprised. Their language was careful, distant, the kind that keeps its hands clean while still applying pressure. Surprised. They expressed concern about the optics of an unauthorized employee accessing proprietary infrastructure. Surprised. The message underneath was clear enough. Resolve this in a way that protects the company's formal structure. Surprised. Diana drafted a response, deleted it, and wrote it again twice until it said what she needed it to say without saying too much of what she actually felt. Surprised. She sent it. She knew, even as she did, that it wouldn't be enough. Surprised. Pratt had already framed the story, and Elijah, who had done nothing except see something clearly and offer it without being asked, was now standing at the center of a fire he hadn't lit. Surprised. She was still at her desk at 8:14 that evening when her assistant forwarded an email from HR. Surprised. Elijah Cross had submitted his resignation, effective immediately, no grievance list. Surprised. Just one line. He appreciated the opportunity and wished the company well. Surprised. Diana read it twice. Then she walked down to the 4th-floor supply closet where his cart stood parked, his thermos, a pair of worn work gloves, and a small navy notebook sealed neatly inside a plastic bag beside it. Surprised. He was already gone. He hadn't told her he was leaving. Surprised. He had simply decided, in the same deliberate way he decided most things, that his presence had become a liability for her, and that removing himself was the cleanest fix available. Surprised. She stood in that hallway for a long time. She had lost Elijah Cross once 17 years ago without ever understanding why. Surprised. She had built an entire career carrying a small, unresolved question about where that particular mind had gone. Surprised. Now she had the answer, and she had watched it walk out the door a second time, this time with her own hands empty and unable to stop it. Surprised. She carried the thermos, the gloves, and the notebook home. Surprised. She made coffee she didn't drink. And then, the next morning before work, she opened the notebook. Surprised. The first pages were exactly what she expected. Equations filling the margins, the kind a restless mind produces when it has nowhere else to put itself. Surprised. Optimization problems, probability chains that resembled, without ever copying, the architecture underneath her own company's systems. Surprised. He hadn't stolen a single idea. He had simply arrived at the same coastline by a completely different road. Surprised. It was the later pages that stopped her cold. The math gave way to short, unaddressed entries in the same careful hand. Surprised. He wrote about the year his wife, Marisol, was diagnosed and the 11 months that followed, and the particular exhaustion of being the only adult left standing in a hospital room at 2 Glide A. Surprised. He wrote about deferring his doctoral funding once and then again, until the university quietly closed the window and moved on without him. Surprised. He wrote about raising their daughter, Naomi, alone afterward, 6 years old when her mother died, 9 now, and about a manager 2 jobs back who told him almost gently that clients felt more comfortable with someone else handling the account. Surprised. He never wrote the word discrimination. He didn't need to. Surprised. The pattern was there in the plain arithmetic of every door that had quietly closed a half-second before he reached it. Surprised. Near the last written page, a single line copied out on its own like something worth returning to. Not everyone who takes the long way around is lost. Surprised. Diana closed the notebook. She got her coat, and she went to find. Surprised. He hadn't listed a home address in the company system, only a P. Surprised. O box, which nobody had thought to question. She pulled the emergency contact form instead, overriding 2 layers of access protocol she didn't particularly care about generating a log for, and found a handwritten address on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that had been sliding for 2 decades and hadn't yet found its way back. Surprised. She drove there herself. The buzzer panel had a dozen names in faded marker and several blank slots. Surprised. Elijah's was their third floor, he answered after a long pause, said her name with nothing attached to it, and buzzed her in. Surprised. His apartment was small, orderly, a single room doing the work of several. Surprised. Books stood in even columns against one wall. A legal pad covered in familiar notation sat on the table by the window, next to a school photo of a girl with her father's steady eyes. Surprised. The project stalled again, Diana said, setting the notebook down between them. Surprised. Foley's team ran with the fix you gave them, but they hit another wall 2 days later. Surprised. What you gave us was correct, it just wasn't the whole problem. Surprised. She kept her voice plain because Elijah had never needed things softened for him. Surprised. I need you to come back. He was quiet for a moment, watching a truck move slowly down the street below. Surprised. I know how it ended, Diana. I know what Pratt did. Surprised. I know you left to make it easier on me, which I never asked you to do, and I'm telling you now, it wasn't necessary. Surprised. I'm not asking you back as a janitor. Surprised. I want you as an internal problem-solving consultant, working directly with the engineering team. Surprised. No title that puts you above anyone. No corner. Surprised. Treated exactly the same as every other employee, which is something I should have enforced the first time. Surprised. What about the board? I handled the board. Surprised. A pause. Two of them pushed back. I told them a man with no current credentials had solved, in under 2 minutes, a failure that a room full of engineers with advanced degrees couldn't crack in 6 hours. And that any company response to that, beginning with removing him, wasn't a company managing its assets intelligently. Surprised. I told them I'd schedule a follow-up meeting the moment they found someone else capable of doing what he did. Surprised. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite disbelief, not quite amusement. Surprised. And Pratt no longer employed here. That decision was mine, and I'd make it again regardless of the conference room. Surprised. What I watched him do over 6 weeks was already enough. Surprised. No heat in her voice, just a correction arriving later than it should have. Surprised. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. I'm not looking for a redemption arc, he said finally, without irony. Surprised. I'm not interested in being somebody's proof that talent always finds a way out. Surprised. Ask my daughter what the last 3 years actually looked like. Surprised. I know, Diana said, that's not what I'm asking you to be. Surprised. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to walk into a building full of people who are very good at narrow things, and spend some time showing them a wider way to think. Surprised. Not to fix them, just to show them there's more than one road to the same answer. Surprised. A beat. You've done that your whole life, Elijah. Surprised. You did it for me in a lecture hall 17 years ago. Surprised. The only difference now is I can actually pay you what that's worth. Surprised. He looked at the notebook a long time, then turned it right side up on the table. The way you handle something you've carried so long you've stopped seeing it clearly. Surprised. No consultant, she answered. Internal. Whatever the business card says, the actual job is exactly what I described. Surprised. There's a room on the 3rd floor used for storage the last 2 years. Surprised. We'll clear it out. Silence again, the kind Diana had learned 17 years ago not to rush. Surprised. All right, he said, not dramatic. Just decided, the way he decided most things, with the fewest words necessary and no performance of the weight behind them. Surprised. Before Elijah's first day back, Diana called every member of the board into her office individually. Surprised. She laid out without embellishment the full record HR had quietly compiled once people stopped being afraid to talk. 3 former employees willing to go on record about Russell Pratt. Surprised. Bethany Coyle, a single mother on the logistics team, described being mocked in a team meeting for leaving early to pick her son up from urgent care. Pratt asking in front of 9 colleagues whether she'd budgeted better for a job that required commitment. Surprised. Marcus Ivey, the same overnight security guard who'd first mentioned Elijah's early mornings, described being accused without a shred of evidence of taking supplies from a locked cabinet, an accusation Pratt dropped only after camera footage proved otherwise, and never apologized for. Surprised. And Elijah himself, whose file HR had reopened, detailing 6 weeks of manufactured write-ups, none of which survived a single honest review. Surprised. Pratt was terminated within the week. In his exit meeting, when HR read the findings back to him line by line, he said only that he had been enforcing standards nobody else had the discipline to enforce, and that the company would regret softening them. Surprised. Not that day, and, according to the 2 people who ran into him afterward, not ever. Surprised. Diana called a full staff meeting the following Monday. 400 people gathered in the atrium, some in chairs, some standing along the walls. Surprised. She told them what had happened with the algorithm in plain language, without softening the part where her own engineering team had failed to solve it first. Surprised. She told them a man working as their janitor had walked past an open door and stopped a $200 million failure in under 2 minutes, and that the company's first instinct, treating that as a liability instead of a gift, had been wrong, and that the person most responsible for turning it into a disciplinary matter no longer worked there. Surprised. She didn't need to say his name. The room already understood. Surprised. She told them Elijah Cross would return not as a janitor, but as a consultant in analytical problem-solving, and that she expected him treated with the same respect owed to anyone in that building. Surprised. When she finished, the room went quiet for a moment. Surprised. Then someone near the back began to clap, and the sound moved through the atrium the way sound moves when it actually means something. Surprised. Elijah started on a Wednesday. Renee handed him a visitor badge at the front desk and told him his room was ready on the 3rd floor, and he thanked her by name before taking the elevator up. Surprised. The room had been cleared over the weekend, a whiteboard mounted on the far wall, a table, 4 chairs, a window overlooking the street. Surprised. He set his notebook down, uncapped a marker, and wrote a single equation at the top of the board. Surprised. Not a solution, just a starting point. Then he stepped back and looked at it the way a man looks at something waiting to become useful. Surprised. 6 months later, the 3rd floor room had a name of its own among the staff. People just called it Elijah's room, and a rotating handful of engineers spent an hour there every Friday working through problems sideways instead of head-on. Surprised. Naomi's school picture sat on the corner of his desk next to a small dish where Renee still, some mornings, left a cup of coffee without a word. Surprised. He kept the mop. It stood in the closet of his apartment, behind the door, in the particular place you keep something you're not done with. Not because you miss what it cost you, but because it marks the distance you cross to get from there to here, one unhurried, deliberate step at a time. Surprised. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The value of a person was never something a title could measure in the first place, and dignity was never anyone's to hand out. It was always ours to simply recognize. Surprised. If this story meant something to you, stay a moment longer. Surprised. Like this video if you believe every person deserves to be seen for who they actually are. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and tell us in the comments. Has someone ever underestimated you before finally seeing who you really were? Surprised. We read every comment and we'll see you in the next story. Surprised. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. Surprised. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Surprised. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. Surprised. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. Surprised. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.